going to talk to you today about the rise of America as an imperial power after the Spanish-American War of 1898. Now, the problem that many historians who look at the American rise to global power have is that imperialism really militated against the political traditions of the United States throughout the 19th century. So when it came to the 1890s, when the United States engaged with war with Spain over colonies, it was quite difficult to reconcile that political tradition with imperial expansion, which was what some Americans were pushing for at the time. So how did the United States come to create its own empire in the 1890s? In fact, and rather ironically, the American empire was gained through wielding an anti-imperialist argument and credentials of the nation against the old empires of Europe, particularly Spain. In 1823, the United States had taken its first tentative steps into the dispute between the old world and the new when President Monroe proclaimed what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, which laid down the claim that the New World was now off limits for any new colonization by European powers. So the United States said that if the old world, if the imperial powers of Europe stayed out of the Western Hemisphere, the United States would itself stay out of the affairs of Europe. Now, it didn't, in 1823, the United States didn't really have the power or the clout or the ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but it did set down a position of the nation that independence in the Western Hemisphere for independent nations would be protected. And the first time that the United States really did have the ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine was in 1890. That is, after the completion of the nation's own internal development and once its industrialization had reached a level that it was able, its economy was large enough and significant enough to pose a challenge to the Europeans. So in 1895, Cuba followed the lead of many other former Spanish colonies in the Americas and revolted against Spanish rule. Nationalist leader José Martí returned to Cuba in 1895 to lead the revolution, and the Cuban rebels invoked the Monroe Doctrine, requesting American assistance in their struggle against the Spanish. Under pressure, Spain brought reforms to Cuba, but these proved to be too little, too late, and the United States encouraged the Cubans to press for complete independence. By 1898, Americans had developed a range of ideological, political, economic, racial and military rationales for engaging in their own imperial adventures. But the Republican tradition of the nation still weighed heavily, and there was no really strong appetite amongst the public for, or broad support for intervention in Cuba. Two dramatic events took place in 1898 that acted as catalysts to the American war against the Spanish. First, the Americans were made aware of a letter written by Spanish diplomat Dupuy de Lome, which was either stolen or leaked to the press. The letter was published in William Randolph Hearst's publication, The New York Journal. In the letter, Delorme had insulted US President McKinley, calling him a weak bidder for the admiration of the crowds, implying that he had no political principles and he was just an opportunist, really. Before publication, Hearst had obviously calculated the effect that this would have on the American public and, of course, on his own sales figures. 2 weeks later, a second incident increased pressure for action when an explosion tore through the American battleship, the USS Maine, which was docked in Havana Harbour, and it killed the 260 American crew members on board. Now, it's generally believed that this explosion came from a fault in the engine, but the US press decided to represent it as a military attack by the Spanish, and carried headlines implying that war was now necessary and kind of appealing to jingoistic sentiments with cries of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And so the yellow journalism of the period is significant because it helped to create a broader acceptance of military intervention in Cuba amongst the general American public. Now, John Hay, the US ambassador to Britain, described the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war because in his estimation it had the highest motive, which was the liberation of Cuba. It was carried on with intelligence, spirit and bravery, and it lasted only 10 weeks. So declared in April, it was over by August, and it had very few American casualties, around 400 soldiers died. And it resulted in the transfer of the former Spanish colonies to US control. The Teller Amendment to the initial war declaration prohibited the US from colonising Cuba directly itself. In large part, this amendment was passed to combat accusations that America had its own imperial designs on the island. It was replaced in 1901 by the Platt Amendment, which imposed conditions on Cuba and set out the ground rules for US-Cuban relationships into the 20th century, including the creation of a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which is still in operation. Under the terms of the Paris Peace Treaty, Spain relinquished control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines to the United States, and the US paid $20 million to Spain in compensation for the Philippines. The Treaty of Paris represented not only the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which had reached back to Columbus's discovery in 1492, but to the beginning of the American Empire in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. The transition from republic to empire was not smooth, however, as opposition came on two fronts. First from the colonists themselves, and second from those Americans who believed that imperialism was a way of betraying America's own political republican traditions. So many Americans believed that life under US rule within the colonial territories would be improved after the experience of the Spanish, but the colonists did not agree, particularly the Filipinos, who immediately upon the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty rebelled against their new colonial master. The war lasted officially for 3 years, but the Filipinos did not achieve independence from US domination until after the Second World War. American voices were also raised against the adoption of imperial policy in the 1890s, and they included novelist Mark Twain, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. American anti-imperialists were really morally outraged at US expansion because they believed imperialism violated the republican principles that were so central to American political culture, especially the need for consent by the governed. Ironically, of course, it was these principles that had informed the US's own intervention in Cuba in the first place.